All right, hello, and thank you everyone for joining Highwire on the Record Cyber Series. I'm Christine Elswick. I lead the cybersecurity practice at Highwire, and we have an outstanding program for you today on election security and protecting the vote. Before I hand it over to our moderator, Rachel, wanted to quickly share a couple of details about the format. So our program is going to run about 40 minutes, and then we're going to open up the floor to Q&A. Please feel free to drop questions into the little chat window there in real time, and we'll address those questions when we get to them during the Q&A portion. Once we get to the Q&A, we'll turn on the mics and cameras for a more interactive Q&A discussion. So thank you again, everyone, for joining, and I will pass it over to you, Rachel.
Thanks so much, Christine. Really excited for this event today. My name is Rachel Tobac, and I'll be your moderator for today's election security panel. I'm the CEO of Social Proof Security, and I work in human hacking, and I practice election machine hacking and campaign hacking sometimes. But I'm really excited to introduce our panelists here today. The first panelist that I want to turn your attention to is Betsy Cooper, Director of Aspen Institute's Tech Policy Hub and former Executive Director of the Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity at the University of California, Berkeley. Next, we have Bill Harrod, MobileIron Federal CTO. After that, we have Maggie MacAlpine, Election Security Specialist and co-founder of the DEF CON Voting Machine Hacking Village. Next, we have Michael Daniel, President and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance and Obama's former cyber czar. Next, we have Mick, Baccio, Security Advisor at Splunk and former Pete for America CISO. So let's jump in here and begin. The first question that we have on our minds today are about threats to the general election. The first thing we want to talk about is, what do you feel is the #1 security threat we face as it relates to the election in 4 months? Mick, I know you have some thoughts here to start us off.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. It's awesome to be here. So when we talk about election hacking, it's a really, really broad topic that I think kind of everything gets jumbled into that. So because I'm kind of a dum-dum, I kept it simple and I put it in 3 big buckets. So the first bucket, I would put like your influence ops, your discourse manipulation. A second bucket is everything the EAC under that umbrella, the voting machines, the administration, the hardware, all the systems themselves. And then the third bucket, the one that I lived in, was campaign cybersecurity. And I think each one of those presents a very unique and very real problem that we could face in November.
Makes sense. Bill, I know you had some thoughts here as well.
Sure, and to sort of elaborate, I think, on some of the things that Mick brought up, you know, I don't think the greatest security threat that we face is in the election in 4 months. I think it's today, or maybe it was several months ago. I think the biggest threat is really the loss of trust from the electorate. You know, if we look at the Twitter hack that we just had, and the amount of misinformation that comes out, if people lose faith in the election process, then I think that's where we have the greatest challenge. And now we have comments from the White House that question the legitimacy of the election and whether he'll step down or whether there'll be a smooth transition of power if that's the way the election turns out.
Absolutely. Anybody else have any other thoughts on that question before we move on to the next one?
Well, I would just say that I agree that at one level, the greatest threat that we face is that Americans will not end up trusting the results. Right, that's the undermining the confidence and the integrity of the election, and sort of however that occurs, that's the threat that we're trying to mitigate and that we're trying to deal with.
Definitely, those are some great points. I think that falls right nicely into our next question here. What is the worst case scenario? Maggie, I know you have some thoughts here.
Sure. So I was thinking about this question, and I think there's sort of, just to get this out of the way first, of course, there's the totally apocalyptic constitutional crisis. Somebody loses and just refuses to vacate office, for example. And I want to say quickly to allay some of those fears. I've seen some of the hysterical reporting around that. That's kind of not how our election system works. You don't vote, you're not voted in to continue your term. You are starting a new term. And if there is no decision by the date, it would simply go to the House Speaker. So that's not necessarily a conflict. And I can't do anything about or really like fully speak to all of the potential catastrophic, fall of the Roman Republic level of things that could theoretically happen in such a case. So I will address the actual thing that I worry about and that keeps me up at night, which is that the electorate not being prepared for how long it might actually take to count the results. We are shifting to a massive increase in mail-in voting, and I think quite rightfully so, but it is a chronically underfunded problem, even though there's been states begging for money all year and that didn't get it. So we've already had a primary in California and a primary in New York that took weeks to get all of the ballots in and to put out an official result. So I'm not sure how many Americans are plugged in enough to understand yet just like that there might not be results on election night. There might be states that don't have results for weeks, and there might be a great deal of uncertainty and undermining faith in the elections and things like that. A lot of rabble rousing, a lot of angst in general over this fact, even though it's not necessarily that something's gone wrong. In fact, that's what should happen. If there's doubt, you should take your time. And I would definitely hope that the message gets out there in the media specifically to not to play to the usual horse race thing of like, we need these results, they need them now, or something has gone wrong. No, this is something going right under extremely unusual circumstances.
Absolutely. That's fascinating and something that I'm not seeing so much in the media right now. So I really do hope that we can get that message out. Betsy, I know you had some thoughts here too.
Yeah, I think for me, it's uncertainty of a different stripe. So we've talked a lot about the electorate's perceptions of uncertainty. I'm worried about actual ballot count uncertainty. I'm worried about the case where, in particular states, the electronic voting records and the actual ballot counts don't add up. And there's no way to resolve the discrepancy, or there appears to be no way to resolve it. I'm concerned about Bush v. Gore Part 2, except with a mix of different types of digital and non-digital systems. And that was just one state. We have a lot of states this time, and we didn't have social media last time either to really drive the quickness of seeking responses. So I'm worried about the scenario in which we can't actually resolve easily the actual vote count, and that we then leave it to a political process, leave it to the Supreme Court, leave it to the Speaker of the House. I think that's really where a potential crisis could occur.
Yeah, what does a hanging chad look like in electronic voting, right? So
exactly.
And I think that's right. And I think part of it also is that, as Maggie said, that time period, while it is not unexpected now, that gap, that vacuum will be filled by social media, and the conspiracy theory will come quickly, and the very real threat of things like AI and deep fakes putting information out in that gap could be very detrimental to the legitimacy of the overall election.
I think that's all fantastic to know about, and hopefully we can get the message out that it is actually expected that it's going to take time to resolve these results at the end of the election. That's something that I don't think a lot of people know. Next question we have here is, what can the government do to prevent those worst case scenarios? What are the steps that we can take? I know Betsy and Michael have some thoughts here, and the rest of our panelists too, I'm sure.
Well, so I think you have to think about it at the federal and then at the state level. And so, I think Michael will have a lot to think about in terms of the federal level since he's seen it before. So I'll defer that to him. At the state level, contingency planning is the #1 piece of advice that I have. So I think if this pandemic has taught us anything, it's that you need to prepare not just for your preferred scenario, but for the one that follows after that, and then your worst case scenario as well. And I think we saw in several of the primaries, Iowa and Nevada particularly, the changing of plans at the very last minute with untested systems. And frankly, I was really glad to see it didn't go a lot worse than it could. All 50 states on a single day doing the election without contingency planning for what could go wrong, that could be really deeply problematic, and the stakes will be much higher. So I think state and locals need to be working together to figure out, what do I do if the ballots are unable to be counted? How do I have a backup plan for that? What if the systems are not working as expected? How do I adjust? And how do I publicly announce how I'm going to adjust so that it's not a surprise to the electorate? And then I think, especially in the electronic voting case, really understanding what you're going to do if, you know, your remote systems are not working, if your backups aren't there. You know, having a way to think about some of those questions is extremely important. And I fear that people are focusing on the best case scenario and not trying to take those next case scenarios into account. But I'd be really interested to know what Michael thinks about that.
No, Betsy, I agree. I mean, one of the things that, you know, I don't think, I certainly didn't quite appreciate until, you know, having gone through the process in 2016 is, you know, elections are a state and local thing. Right, and that's actually a constitutional strength, right? It provides a check on the federal government that the elections are not run by the federal government. But the result of that means that, you know, we are having to work out a lot of things that weren't problems prior to the emergence of a lot of these cyber threats. And so, you know, I think Betsy's absolutely right. From the state and local level, it's about having those incident response plans, but it's also not getting distracted by all the bright, shiny objects and fancy whiz-bang, you know, cybersecurity stuff, right? In the next shiny, blinky box, right? It's the basics. It's securing your voter registration database as best you can. It's focusing on multi-factor authentication. It's having, you know, stuff with an audit trail. None of this is particularly, from a technical standpoint, is not rocket science, right? It's very difficult from an organizational standpoint, very difficult to implement, but it's not really fancy technology. You know, I think from the federal standpoint, the objective is really to provide support. And the federal government should really be thinking of it as think of itself as being in a supporting role, providing resources, both money and people, providing intelligence and capability. And then in sort of the other space aimed at the adversaries, the United States government has a whole range of tools that it should be doing, including declaratory statements about what would constitute, you know, an action that we would respond to. Conducting diplomacy, both with our friends, our frenemies, and our enemies. You know, conducting disruption operations. Like, if we know of the actors that are targeting these, then in my view, that they are legitimate targets for us to go after because they are a threat to national security. And then incident response preparation at the federal level. I mean, one of the things that Betsy's absolutely right on, the lesson that we've learned over and over again is, particularly in this age of social media, you have got to get ahead of the story. And one of the bits that I'm sure that Maggie has seen, and Rachel, you've seen too, that in every single election, stuff goes wrong, right? That's a normal part of the process, and it's just usually because of stupid stuff. But in an age of, you know, social media and other things, these incidents can get blown up really fast, and you've really got to stay on top of that and have your incident response plan, you know, practiced and in place by election day.
So I think part of what, and Betsy and Michael both are exactly right. I think, you know, back when I was at the White House over the last election, you know, some of the things we would do, you have contingency plans for all the things, and you have a contingency plan for that contingency plan. And come November, there's going to be that gap of time when we don't really know who won the election. Unless it's the blowout, but like that's a whole different thing. But there's going to be a couple of days, could be a week. And to Betsy's point, you know, we've all lost stuff in the mail. So what are we going to do about that? I think, you know, the government is doing a great job when you look at DHS, CISA, what Krebs and what Matt Masterson's doing out there. It's really fantastic work. I think the problem becomes politics are partisan, and they should be, right? It's politics. Security is apolitical, and I'm a security nerd, so I'm approaching it from that perspective. And it's hard to secure elections without introducing politics to it. And I think all of us, no matter what bucket we're living in, have found that roadblock more often than not.
Yeah, and I think, as much as we'd like for the government to be proactive in helping the states transition, for those states that are still doing electronic capture of voting, that ship has kind of sailed. But I think the education piece is where the government needs to be in front right now, to say, this is what we're doing. This is how we make sure that we have strong audit trails, and that your vote can count. We see the primary in Kentucky, where at the last minute they closed a bunch of polling places. Getting the word out early about that, and just about how the process will work. And the government is in a particularly strong place to do that proactive education piece, I think.
These are all fantastic points. I think there's a lot of messaging that can come out from our government to clearly communicate what to expect come November. The next question we have here is, the recent Twitter hack exposed once again that the vulnerability of social media and how dangerous attacks on it can be. What danger does this kind of attack pose to the election, if any? And is this the next phase of disinformation? The first person I want to pass this one to is Mick.
So like back when I was at Pete for America, and the same thing, and throughout my career, again, I'm a security nerd. So we tabletop all the things. Like you have, hey, if this happens, what are we gonna do? We need to make sure that you have, legal comms, the principal, just to make sure everyone's on the same page and you're communicating that message. And having that plan in your pocket is super valuable before. I think the phrase we keep using is like left a boom. Get ahead of it before it happens. And the Twitter hack, I looked at it, hey, if it's one account, it's a problem. If it's multiple accounts and the people that were involved, it's on Twitter's back end. So it kind of falls into that tabletop into a larger section of this is a false statement that got put out. What do we do about it? And in a larger context, I would look at it the same way, like with a cyber threat intelligence background. This is like a supply chain threat. I'm not going to hack you. I'm going to go upstream and hack that. And I think that is a huge recipe that we're seeing from nation state actors, not in the political realm, but in other industries, other verticals.
Definitely. I know Maggie and Betsy potentially have some thoughts here as well.
Sure. So one thing when I was thinking of this question, I was thinking about was that in 2016 in Ghana, the election commission was hacked, and it caused the site to go down, which was a trusted information location for the results of the election. And despite the candidates agreeing not to foment unrest, there was violence that broke out, and a person died. Which is definitely a worst case scenario of just what the results of misinformation around an election can be. It's definitely something that would keep me up at night. So I think on the one hand, you have states and big tech and a bunch of secretaries of state working to do something, a trusted information program, which is that you could go to the state election website and know that those are where all the official results are. But first of all, getting the word out about that source, and also those sources becoming targets for uncertainty is definitely something I would worry about. But definitely to the Twitter hack, social media is just, it's going to be a huge problem, no doubt, and as it has been throughout the primary process too, as far as conspiracy theories and false results. And I don't envy the person whose problem that is.
And I think it relates as well to how to engage with the social media companies. So I think sometimes we aggregate too many different things into this disinformation, misinformation bucket. So there's actually false information, But then there's a lot of statements, and I think many of the president's tweets actually fall into this category rather than the true, like the falsity category, which is the category of people who are misleading but technically true, or misleading but giving an opinion which is hard to gauge the factualness. So I actually found it interesting that some of the things that Twitter flagged when they were flagging the president's tweets weren't necessarily factual statements. They were sort of giving his opinions about facts, and that's a lot of a harder thing for the platforms to deal with. So I think you have different layers of this problem. First, you have just the amount of content that's getting disseminated very quickly that could influence how people think about the election. But then on the how do you protect against that side, there's an awful lot of that content that either technically isn't false or is giving an opinion. Really hard to decide what to do with that. So I think throughout the next 6 months, you're going to see a back and forth as the different platforms try different techniques to engage against this. But frankly, it's going to be much smaller effort than the amount of content being put out to influence the election. And that's where I get nervous as to whether or not it could actually swing votes one way or the other.
Totally.
And I think the other thing that, and this is true not just in the election context, right? I mean, we're seeing this across the board. And what I think, we're witnessing as a society is that we have got to come to a completely different relationship to our information, right? And it wasn't that long ago. It was a long time ago when I went to college, but not that long ago, right? In the grand scheme of things, it was still hard to find information and to get information. And so we had to teach people how to get information. It was expensive to put information out. So mostly we could trust the fact that if it was out there, more of it tended to be true because it was so expensive to do that and it was expensive to find. Now it's really cheap and easy. And the skills that we need to be developing as a society is how we actually sort through information and live in the sea of information that we're in rather than actually having to go through and rifle through a card catalog, if any of you remember that, to actually find, the source and then go pull it off of a shelf instead of just typing or speaking into our phones. And that's a very different information environment, whether we're talking about for elections or any of the other issues that we deal with as societies. And so in some ways, what we're seeing with elections is just a reflection of this broader shift in how we have to relate to the information environment.
You're right. The information environment has changed so much from the Dewey Decimal System to social media. There's a lot of complexity there. I want to turn our attention now to COVID-19 and the remote elections. The first question we have in this category is, how has COVID-19 affected election security, and has it changed the calculations or accelerated trends that are already happening? Bill, I know you have some thoughts here.
Yeah, so I think COVID-19 has had a huge impact. I think it certainly has changed everybody's perspective on how this election process will go. And to tie on to what Michael and Betsy just said about information, my perception of it is that even media reporters don't have the same access to the candidates in the campaign for that same kind of constant validation, verification of comments and refinements, and in person. And I think that's one of the things that really will change it. So, the social media, the Twitter sphere is going to have a big impact. But I think the actual mechanics, right? So back to Mick's buckets about how we do it. There's the misinformation, and then there is the actual process and components of the election, and absentee voting and vote by mail are going to be a much larger portion than normal. And I think states and counties where the votes get counted is where we need to focus some of that automation as well. So being able to make sure people understand the proper procedures, how to complete their ballots. I think it was Georgia where they were holding out large numbers of ballots because there was a question about whether the signature matched or whether it was in the right envelope. And to some extent, I think that's where some of the politics has entered into it again. And it's going to have a large impact on those that are already at the margins of being able to exercise their ability to vote. And I think that's one of the things that we really need to make sure we have instituted a good faith effort to get every vote counted. And if there are volumes of votes that are questionable, that we then hold those in some sort of a tentative or provisional bucket and be able to go back and look at those. The electronic vote by mail or the electronic in-person voting where you're actually recording it on a machine, it's hard to get a paper backup for accountability on that. You know, there is no hanging chad there, but I think the ballots that come in, whether they be absentee ballots from overseas or whether they just be mail-in ballots or even ballots that people are mailed to people, they fill out and drop off in a secure location. I think all of those are going to be things that we really need to look closely at to be able to vote in the time of COVID.
Absolutely. Those are fantastic points. So the next question I want to cover is, we're seeing a lot of chatter about online or smartphone voting under COVID-19. Can you please give our audience your thoughts on online or smartphone voting? Maggie, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. This is a question that comes up a lot in the election security world, and it's universal. Like, there's no ambiguity about it. Every election security expert is like, this is a terrible idea. And you'll inevitably get somebody being like, but what about this thing? Yes, we've thought about that. It doesn't work. Benedita the other day had a really great comparison where he said, it's a little bit like saying, well, we landed on the moon, so why can't we land on the sun? Those are extremely different questions. So at the root of the problem is the problem of authentication. How do we know that you were remotely and without some sort of paper trail allowed to vote in this race, that your vote was recorded as cast, and then that it was counted? And all of those things become exponentially more difficult along with the secret ballot and done remotely over digital. So it's basically, Professor Matt Blaze once called this the most difficult computer science problem faced in the modern world. We are actually decades away from having something that can be both anonymous and auditable. Those two problems are pretty mutually exclusive right now. And anybody who says they've come up with a solution, I say, where are your trillions of dollars? You just created anonymous online currency. So you have made a lot more money than, this isn't your first problem that you're going to solve if you have that kind of technology at your disposal. And second of all, I would basically say, and if we could have a non-secret ballot, yes, in theory, you could solve this problem tomorrow. The problem with that, because that's the online banking comparison people make, which is like, why can't I just do this like I do banking? Well, you and your bank know how much money you have, and that's completely fine. You're both on board with that concept. On the other hand, though, your vote being secret is secret for a reason. It's secret for a lot of very good reasons. I hope that's not on my end. For example, even just look at 2016. How many people are totally comfortable with their family knowing how they voted, how their boss, their in-laws knowing how they voted, their boss knowing how they voted, your potential future boss knowing how you voted? Even if that information is somehow limited to a small number and an insider tech firm that is the only people who knows who you are you also okay with that? Are you sure it's never going to leak? Are you sure that firm should be, responsible for reporting how these votes were cast with no other backup evidence? So it's basically just an incredibly difficult and intractable problem. It's well intentioned, but it's definitely not something we should be looking at. It's not something that's possible right now, basically.
That's a really, really good point. The next question we have here is, there's a lot of misinformation out there about voter fraud. Let's set the record straight on absentee voting and vote by mail. Can individuals feel safe that their absentee voting and vote by mail ballots won't be compromised? Betsy, I know you have some thoughts here.
Sure. So I think I just want you to imagine for a second the paper ballots that you've seen before, that you have received in the mail. Here in California, we get an extremely lengthy, sort of looks like a Scantron from your childhood that you have to fill out. It would be extraordinarily difficult for somebody to take my ballot and change my votes in a meaningful way. It would be even harder to do that at scale. And so I do think that we can be confident that individual ballots, if you put the things that you want to vote for and you fill out that form correctly, which, by the way, as we learned in Bush v. Gore, is not a guarantee, you should have confidence that your votes will be taken, the votes that you've delivered will be taken seriously. Here's where problems can occur. The actual mail process. We want to make sure that the mail system is ready to actually distribute these things on time. We've had deep problems in COVID with mail being delayed. And so I think we need to think about how these systems in certain states could be overwhelmed. And of course, if there's a malicious actor who somehow wanted to change an individual ballot, they could do that for their own ballot. Perhaps it might be harder to get to that at scale. There could be issues with the count once you actually are counting the ballots. If, again, a malicious actor were to try to affect the systems there. But you don't have to worry that somebody's going to get into your individual ballot and change the numbers. And I think that's it's a straw man to distract from many of the real issues that we should be talking about in terms of election security. But I'd love to know what others think about that.
Well, I mean, I think that just study after study after study and state after state after state has found very little evidence of systemic voter fraud. And when you just look at it, that's just not a problem that we face in any sort of broad, systematic means. And frankly, it's actually another reason, to Maggie's point about why having a secret ballot is actually so important, is because one of the things that a secret ballot does for you is it means that people can't pay off people to vote in a certain way, because there's no way to verify who you voted for. So nobody's going to pay you for that. And we've seen that in other places where they don't have secret ballots. So, I mean, I think that that's the straw man, red herring, distraction from, where the actual problems are.
Yeah, I kind of agree 100% on that. Everything that Betsy touched on is 100% accurate. Your vote will be counted the way you marked it, provided you marked it correctly. We talked about those big buckets, right? And the election administration is one big bucket, but underneath that, yes, your vote will get counted the way you marked it, provided it got there in time, provided, a whole host of other things, but the high level issue, yes, I believe that part of the equation is safe. And you kind of touched on it earlier. I could bank online, but I can't vote online. I'll counter that argument super fast. How many compliance regulations does your bank have to go through compared to your voting system? And until you fix that, then that's a dumb argument.
There are just so many arguments against it. Where do you even begin? There's not enough time on this talk.
Yeah, and voting online, like, I'm a nerd. We can do it. By November, no, get out of here. But it can be done. Maybe 2024, 2028, if we stop talking about it every 4 years. I feel like we could have had this conversation in 2016. We're just talking about new, different threats. The ballot thing, we've been talking about that, Bush v. Gore. It's 20 years ago, and we're still having the same issues. I think it can be done, but by November, no, it's your absentee ballot's the way to go. And it will be counted the way you mark it.
Definitely.
Yeah. And identity, stronger encryption on the mobile device. There are a whole host of things that Mick's right. There are things that are solvable, but not between now and November, and certainly not something that we'll see tested and deployed, right? And that was part of the problem with Iowa, with the app that they rolled out. It just wasn't tested at anything like the scale that they needed to be able to do. So, I think it's possible, but not for this election. And as long as we can address making it as simple as possible so that there's not the sort of overly strict, rigorous evaluation of each piece of paper that comes in, that we have a good faith effort in getting all those votes counted, then I think we're pretty well off in being able to do the absentee and mail-in ballots.
Fantastic. I know we're coming to the end of our time here, and we have a lot of questions coming in from the reporters on the line. So I want to spend about 2 minutes making sure we end on an optimistic note here. I know there's a lot of thoughts about the threats and worst case scenarios of election security. What can we be optimistic about? What have we made progress in since 2016? And do you see that progress continuing? I'll pass it off to you first, Maggie.
So basically, I would say one of the good things that came out of 2016 is that there's immense awareness around these issues that wasn't there before. I was in this world since 2010. People who've been there longer agree that usually when you told people that about securing elections, their eyes would glaze over immediately, or they'd look at you like you had two heads. They didn't understand it as an issue at all. So lately, this is now a mainstream discussion. So that's very positive. Also, the fact that we're reducing the number of states that don't have paper trails. That's huge. We're down from 14 to 8, I believe, when I checked the news this morning. And also more places are adopting auditing measures, which is all like great news and very positive.
That's fantastic. I think we have time for one more person's optimistic thoughts. Who would like to take that?
Give it a shot. So I'm super optimistic. Like after 2016, being at the White House then, like seeing all the things that happened, I got a job as a CISO in a campaign, and that never happened before. Chris is over at Vice President Biden's camp. Michael Kaiser in Defending Digital Campaigns is a new organization that launched to help out campaigns. The Cyber Threat Alliance is going strong. I mean, there are so many organizations and so many people that want to help. I think we're in a much better place. I do think our problem set has shifted a little bit. Our threat model's changed. But I see so many folks that want to raise the bar together. I'm super optimistic about it.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, and
Michael,
I think the fact that, sorry.
So I was going to pass to Michael real quick here. Michael, I could tell you had a thought here as Mick was speaking.
Well, the only thing I would just build on is there's also much better relationships, right? We started, we went into 2016, there was a lot of distrust between the federal government and the state government. A lot of the people didn't even know each other about who was, at DHS or the FBI, who was actually involved in running elections at the state and local level. And a lot of those relationships are much more mature now. And that's a huge advantage.
Definitely. Bill, you want to take us out here with one last thought?
I just think that, as Mick said, I think the campaigns are much more aware and much more on top of this. Even things like encrypting their communications and doing the smart things as if a campaign were a business, and looking at cybersecurity is a big part of that. So I think that is one of the bright spots on this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for our panelists. We have some questions coming in here. I know that the folks who are watching can turn on their audio, potentially video, if you're interested in sharing. The first question that I would like the panelists to cover that comes from our audience comes from Frank, and this would be, what response would be appropriate if the malicious actor was domestic instead of a foreign state? Does somebody want to take that first?
I think ODNI announcing a few days ago they were taking the lead on the briefings. I think when you have a centralized point like that, if it's domestic, it's going to go to a different agency, FBI will get involved, blah, 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 blah. But I think establishing those relationships to a centralized point like ODNI or DHS, I think that'll be super helpful. I do think the response is different. I don't think it would be uncommon, but I think your response will be different depending on whether the actor, had a foreign nexus or not.
Any other thoughts on that question from our panelists?
In that case, it's actually, if we can identify the actor and know that it's domestic, then, I think some, FBI agents would go pay them a visit to explain the error of their ways. So.
Definitely. One question that we have next here is, let's see, from Elizabeth of FedTech. What response would be appropriate if the malicious actor was domestic instead of a foreign state? What should we do?
Well, again, I think it's actually going to, it's going to be difficult to actually sort. In reality, it's going to probably be very difficult to sort out all the different pieces and to do it really quickly. I think that in some ways we've actually got more tools available to us, domestically, because if it's a domestic, then we are. If the people behind it are domestic, then we are more likely to be able to physically identify them and actually get to them, right? And it depends on the kind of activity that you're also talking about. If you're talking about hacking into voting systems and those kinds of things, that's a crime, and you can be arrested for that if you're doing that with malicious intent, right? If you're talking about disinformation, that is gets to be a lot more murky because First Amendment allows you to even say things that are not true, but there are still things, there are still limits on that. The old cliche about not being able to shout fire in a crowded theater. So again, there's sort of some gray spaces in there, but I actually think if the actors are domestic, we've actually got more tools to address that than if they're foreign in many ways.
Definitely. Thank you.
Like, sorry to interrupt here. Frank, I want to make sure we answer the question that you're trying to get your answer to. So do you want to unmute real quick? Apologies if we...
Yes, we'd love to hear that again.
Can you hear me?
Yep,
yes.
We can hear you.
So my question was, a number of countries have laws that bar discussions of elections in the media, sometimes for days ahead of voting until results are in. I mean, should we impose federal fines on the dissemination of bogus election results? And my second question is, if a foreign actor is disseminating disinformation, then what sort of consequences should they face? I mean, we haven't heard anything from the government. Don't you think we should?
I think, and this is just me, the big problem with disinformation, one, and it's just my opinion, like putting a gag on the media in the United States saying don't talk about the election, that's a non-starter. Like, I can't see any scenario where that's going to happen. Overseas, I think the problem with disinformation is that everything that we see is kind of in hindsight. We aren't very great at detecting long-term campaigns real time, and some folks are the team at Graphica are doing fantastic work, but I think we're kind of behind the ball a little bit. So if there was some kind of disinformation coming out from a foreign nexus, I think our reaction would be the same, as it was from a our response would be the same as a government, but I don't think that we would kind of stop it real fast. I just don't think we have that technical capability.
I just add on the first point that obviously the First Amendment plays in here pretty strongly. That's the key difference between our country and many of the other countries in terms of our ability to limit what people talk about. And bluntly, even if you were to try to make an argument that it was permissible under the First Amendment to limit talk about elections, that would completely lead to litigation, to complete distraction, and probably more discussion of the election rather than less. And
right, but my question was dissemination of bogus election results. That was a specific bit of disinformation, not a lot of the information that's out there that is contested.
Well, I'm responding to your first point, which was countries barring discussion of elections in the media.
Oh, yeah, right.
That's the piece that I'm responding to.
Yeah.
On the federal fines for dissemination of bogus election results, bluntly, you would need to pass legislation to do that, and you're not going to get that sort of legislation in this Congress. So I think it's moot for this election.
Thank you, Betsy. I think that's a fantastic point here. And sorry, Frank, for misattributing your question. I wasn't able to see it in the chat. Next question we have here is from Joseph Marks. Joseph, I want to make sure that I cover all of your questions accurately. Are you comfortable turning on your audio rather and asking your question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I had to maximize the screen again. Number one, during the House Judiciary hearing today, Attorney General Barr reiterated his concerns that widespread voting by mail could lead to widespread fraud during the election. Do you have concerns about that, and specifically about it coming from the Attorney General?
So and this is strictly my opinion. There are concerns with that sort of hyperbole, I think, coming out of the Department of Justice, out of the administration. I think we did a pretty good job of talking about the fact that there just really hasn't been any significant proof of that sort of widespread fraud. As Betsy, I think, said, you may be able to change a ballot, but to change ballots in volume just doesn't seem realistic. And I think a lot of the discussion about voter fraud really is about voter registration, and I think protecting the back-end voter registration databases and then validating voters is doable. And I don't think that we'll see widespread fraud.
I don't think it's the first time Attorney General Barr has said that, and I don't think it's going to be, and maybe he's right. I haven't really dug into it as much as other folks have, but if you are right, I haven't seen the receipts yet. So maybe he's right, but until I see proof, I think it's a completely invalid argument. And if you're going to throw an election, trying to change a vote over the mail is just the dumbest way to do it. But I haven't seen any proof of the claims that he's made a couple times. So I'm not saying he's wrong. I just, show me the receipts.
Joseph, I know you have a follow-up question regarding...
Oh, yeah, sure. Sorry. Just a second question. The Republican Senate version of the coronavirus relief bill came out yesterday. It didn't include any money for voting by mail. Maybe that's an opening position because the Democrats are seeking $3.6 billion, and maybe they'll come somewhere in between. Do you have concerns about where that stands now? And given that we're, into July, who knows when a compromised version of this bill is going to come out? Are we running short on things that we can actually accomplish with more money at this point?
Certainly, there are things that you can spend money on, Joe, all the way up to, practically to Election Day. But it is very true, that, for example, a lot of systems and other things, because of the way that secretaries of state have to certify them, they're already done. And they cannot touch them between now and the election. And you are absolutely right that we are running out of runway for certain things. So that's why we have to look at this as not a, one-time infusion of cash is not the way to do this. We need much more sustained resources over an extended period of time. And I've forgotten, it came up earlier in the conversation. We need to be having these conversations in off years. And over time, so that we're not having this sort of every time it's like we forget about it on, by November 5th, we've already forgotten about, all of this and, everybody's moved on and then nobody remembers it again until the July before the election, except for the people who are actually having to work at this. Mm-hmm. And that's not doable. It's like we've got to be thinking about this in a much more sustained long-term investment to raise the level of cybersecurity across the entire electoral infrastructure. And that requires a very different funding model from the federal government, in my view, that's much more akin to the way that we do, transportation and other kinds of grants that are, matched by the states over an extended period of time, where you can really get the kind of resource improvement, the security improvements that we need.
Yeah, and I think to speak to that specifically, right, we're less than 100 days out now. Right, I forget, it's 96 days something to the election. Printing all of the mail-in ballots that may be needed that weren't previously anticipated, and making sure that the Postal Service is ready to accommodate that volume, to get the ballots delivered in time and then get the votes back and processed, postmarked, and the votes, the completed ballots to the election offices by the deadline. I think those are areas where an influx of money now could be helpful, but if it goes on for a long time, we will have missed the window to make any real impact.
I think an argument may be made that we've already missed it, to be fair.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's kind of sad, like I said it earlier, politics are partisan, and I get that, but security is not. And until we take the politics out of election security, I just think we're going to keep having the conversation. We're raising the bar, but we're not raising as fast as we could or as high as we could, just because we can't seem to take the politics out of it. Or to Michael's point, only talk about it once every couple years.
Yeah, I once said that elections have a leap year birthday. They're a fourth the age of maturity of every other thing out there.
That's a great point, Maggie.
That's really good. I'm going to steal that.
I like that. I'm going to steal that too.
Yeah, I'm going to steal that one.
We'll attribute it. It
will be attributed to Maggie for sure. We have a question from Elizabeth. Elizabeth, if you're comfortable turning on your audio, I want to make sure you ask it the exact way that you'd like it to be answered.
Okay. You talk about the lag in counting mailed-in votes. Is there any technology that can help speed up the count in a state that votes by mail? And what technology can be used to help verify mailed-in votes?
Does anyone know? Technology that can help speed up that counting for those absentee ballots coming in.
I'm afraid that's just really simple mail processing technology, which is also like large industrial equipment, which is, again, expensive and takes some time to implement, which again, that window comes up again. But yeah, if you look at the states that have mail-in voting and one of those cool videos where they go behind the scenes and show your envelopes being sorted and, counted and stuff like that, it's not election specific. It's very manual, it's very paper-based, and it's very familiar. It's mail sorting equipment.
Next, we have a question from Jeff Elder. Elder, can you please turn on your mic here? Thank you.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. Great job. Mick said the other day, if 2020 is a disaster movie, the election is the final scene. There's this sense of national suspense, to say the least, maybe even dread. And what I wanted to ask was, election night, do we know what we're going to see? How could we instill a little bit of calm going in? Or is this going to be, we're all going to be sitting there on the edge of our seats?
I think it's going to be different. It's going to be the edge of your seat, but I think it's going to be different, right? When you look at 2016 and the months leading up to the election, and I remember because I read them all, there was like 58,000 some odd emails that got dumped out online, between September and like October. You had everything that's happening, and I think you'll have not a campaign compromise or something. I hope not, but you're going to have some kind of distraction like that, whether it's the coronavirus, whether it's anything else that's going on in 2020. I think there's going to be some kind of distraction from the actual election. And I think the bigger threat beyond that is, we've all talked about it, those next couple days where the last vote is in, but we haven't counted anything and we're not done counting. How long is that going to take? And I think that uncertainty window is going to be the edge of your seat time.
And just to add to that, I don't know that election night is the right comparison. Because of the coronavirus, it is the likelihood is highest that it's ever been, at least in my lifetime, that we will not know the result election night or the morning after.
100%.
So as a result of that, if we want to prepare people, the biggest thing that we can do is say election night is not the moment, and then try to the best we can to set up a time frame for when that moment will come. But we really need to set expectations that election night is not going to feel the way it has before. As someone on the West Coast, I'm a little sad. The East Coasters might not be as sad if they don't have
Is this going to be a 1 week thing, or is this going to be a year 2000 thing where it's a month?
It depends on litigation, right? So, one would hope that the ballot initial counts will be finished, I can't give a specific timeline, but in a week or two max. But then the challenges to those will almost inevitably arise, and that's where it gets very unpredictable as to the time frame.
Yes, keep in mind some mail-in voting can be postmarked to the day of the election. So that could mean however long it takes for those ballots to come in by mail.
Yeah, and I think having the campaigns not have the big ballrooms and all of the balloons and not have the state by state numbers tallying up on the big board, I think all of those things are things that we could do in advance. to make people more aware that it's likely to be a lag, and to be more comfortable with it.
Absolutely fantastic. It sounds like we have fantastic messages to go out to the world to prepare them with the right level of expectations for this upcoming election. We are coming to the end of our time here. I want to pass it back to Christine and thank our panelists for their amazing words today, and they were so helpful. So thank you so much. It was an honor to moderate.
Thank you, Rachel. Yes, I just wanted to thank all of our panelists again, and Rachel for moderating, and to every one of you, all of you journalists who've joined us for this discussion. Thank you so much for your time. Very fascinating discussion, very important discussion. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right, have a great rest of the day, everyone.